Hello, everybody. We're going to give it another 30 seconds. We've actually gotten a huge response to this webinar, and they're still trickling in. So I think we'll give it another maybe 30 seconds, and then we'll begin. Okay, so I think we'll start. We've got a lot to cover. So if Keely, would you mind bringing up my slides? So we could begin. I want to welcome everybody. Welcome to this month's Encore Network program, Ageism from the Inside Out and Outside In. We're thrilled to have all of you here with us today. My name is Remus Jason. I'm the Executive Director of PSS, a multi-service nonprofit in New York City. And one of PSS's major programs is Coming of Age, which strives to inspire everyone 50 and older to live with passion and purpose. And Coming of Age is a member of the Encore Network. The Encore Network's mission is to create community, stimulate learning, and inspire action. And its members believe that together we will transform this Encore stage of life. And it's a truly wonderful network to belong to, and I hope you consider joining. As you might have seen from the earlier slides, members of the Encore Network enjoy a wide array of network benefits, such as free or discounted access to monthly programs, participation in affinity groups, and other opportunities that include promoting their programs and events through the Encore Network website and its newsletters. Next slide. In fact, 9 Encore Network organizations partnered together to bring you this webinar today. So a huge thanks to all of these organizations. If you're interested in learning about them or the Encore Network, we encourage you to visit the encorenetwork.org. Next slide. A couple of quick housekeeping items. Everybody will be on mute to avoid background noise, but we do encourage you to use the Q&A feature to ask any questions you might have. We'll be monitoring those questions, and the moderator will be pausing occasionally so that we could have those questions addressed. And you'll find that Q&A function somewhere on your screen. Usually it's at the bottom. So we encourage you to use that to submit your questions. While we won't be sharing any slides from today's discussion, this session is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be shared with everyone via email so that they can watch it again as often as they'd like. So moving on, I can't think of 3 people more qualified to speak about ageism than today's presenters, Ashton Applewhite, Dr. Connie Zweig, and Harry Moody. So now I'm going to turn it over to today's moderator, Harry Moody. He's a retired vice president from AARP, and he's now faculty in the Creative Longevity and Wisdom program at Fielding Graduate University. Rick?
Great, thanks very much, Remus. My job is really to be a funnel here today, as Remus stated very clearly. And the first job that I have in funneling is to introduce our speakers, who are the real talent for today. The first one is Connie Zweig. We can see her on the screen now. Ashton Applewhite is here, I know, because she was here earlier, and we'll see her shortly. Here she is, as they said in Johnny Carson, the introducer to Johnny Carson, dating myself there. Let me begin with Ashton Applewhite. She's an internationally renowned expert on ageism, which is our subject today, and she's the author of a book, This Chair Rocks, a Manifesto Against Ageism. She's co-founder, of the Old School Anti-Ageism Clearinghouse, and she's a public speaker at venues that have included the TED main stage and the United Nations. Equally on our platform today is Connie Zweig. Raise your hand, Connie. She is known as the shadow expert. I sometimes call her the shadow queen. And Dr. Connie extends her work into midlife now and beyond with her new book, The Inner Work of Age, which focuses on extending our emotional and spiritual development along with our extended longevity. Those are our two speakers. And with that, I turn it over to them. I have a question, which I'll answer first of all. I'm 76 years old, and I'm interested in knowing about our speakers. How old are you? And why did you write their books?
I have 72 years of life experience.
And I'm
Okay.
69.
How about you, Ashton?
69.
All right, so we're all in the ballpark together. I'm an elder. How about your work? I'm interested in how you got interested in this and what drove you to write these books about aging and ageism. Just jump in. This is a conversation.
Well, Ashton was going to speak first. Do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I'm going to give a brief 10 minutes sort of intro to ageism as a preface
That's what we
to
need.
Connie's
we need.
remarks. Ageism 101. How about that?
Good. I'm ready for it.
So, all right. I'm going to start with the word old and have everyone think for a minute about how that word makes you feel.
Mhm.
It used to fill me with real apprehension, which answers your question, Rick. That's why I started writing about it. What was my darkest fear? Ending up in some grim institutional hallway. And then I did a little digging around and learned that the percentage of Americans over 65 in nursing homes, not all senior residences, but nursing homes, is 2.5%. And it continues to drop. What else was I worried about? Dementia. Alzheimer's is a terrible disease, but it is not typical of aging. 90% of us are going to think just fine to the end. And dementia rates are falling. The likelihood of anyone at this webinar getting dementia has gotten lower and lower, and people are being diagnosed at later ages. The real epidemic is anxiety over memory loss. Another assumption was that old people were depressed because they were old and they were going to die soon. And then I learned that people were happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives. It's called the U-curve of happiness. And it has been borne out by dozens of studies in the US and around the world. You don't have to be a Buddhist, probably helps, or a billionaire. The curve is a function of the way aging itself affects the brain. So I started feeling a lot better about getting older, and I started obsessing about why so few people know these things. They are easy. These facts are at the top of the internet. The reason is ageism, discrimination and stereotyping on the basis of age. Stereotyping is always a mistake, of course, but especially when it comes to age, because the longer we live, the more different from one another we become. We experience ageism anytime someone assumes that we are too old, air quotes around that, for something instead of finding out who we are, what we're capable of, or too young. Ageism cuts both ways, and younger people experience a lot of it too. It's any judgment about a person or a group of people based on how old we think they are. Nobody's born ageist, but it starts in early childhood, around the same time that attitudes towards race and gender start to form.
Mhm.
Because negative messages about late life come at us from the media and popular culture at every turn, right? Old people are incompetent. Wrinkles are ugly. It's sad to be old. And we olders can be the most ageist of all, which was something that took me completely by surprise when I started thinking about this, because we have had a lifetime of absorbing these messages, typically unconsciously, and never thought to question them. Right? We haven't started on that inner work that Dr. Zweig is going to talk about. And when prejudice gets a pass the way ageism has until very recently, it seems normal, just the way things are. And unless we challenge the underlying message that to age is to lose value as a human being, it becomes part of our identity. That is internalized ageism. Aging is not the problem. Discrimination is the problem. It's not being women that makes life harder for women. It's sexism. It's not loving another man that makes life harder for gay guys. It's homophobia. And it is not the passage of time that makes getting older so much harder than it should be. It's ageism. When labels are hard to read, or we can't hear the person speaking, or we can't open the damn jar, we tend to think I should be more limber or stronger or better prepared, or maybe even like I should have stayed home. We tend to blame ourselves instead of blaming the ageism that makes these natural transitions shameful and the discrimination that makes those barriers acceptable. And this discrimination harms us all in lots of ways. One place that most people bang into it, sometimes it's the first form of discrimination that white men encounter, is the workplace. Longer lives obviously require working longer, right? Earning more, saving more. And yet 2/3 of American workers report encountering age discrimination. Not one negative stereotype about older workers is true. Age discrimination makes companies less profitable and less creative. It is also illegal, and fewer companies are getting away with it. Ageism also harms our health. Ageism in medicine means less treatment, worse treatment, often no treatment at all. Why should we accept a different standard of care for older people? That is institutionalized ageism at work. Internalized ageism matters too, a lot, as Dr. Zweig will be talking about at length in her remarks. There's a growing body of fascinating research that shows that people with more positive feelings about aging, which is really just fact rather than fear-based attitudes, walk faster, heal quicker, and live longer. And ageism also affects cognition. People who associate old age with growth and purpose are less likely to develop dementia, even if they have the gene that predisposes them for the disease. That's research by Becca Levy out of Yale. That's why the World Health Organization launched a global campaign to combat ageism. That's the name of it, this spring, to extend not just lifespan, but health span, right? The percentage of our lives that we spend in good shape. Ageism disproportionately affects women because we encounter the double whammy of ageism and sexism. There's a double standard at work here, shocker. The notion that aging enhances men and devalues women. And we women reinforce this double standard when we compete to stay young, a punishing, expensive, impossible proposition. And these effects add up over time and are further compounded by race and by class, which is why everywhere in the world, the poorest of the poor and sickest of the sick are old women of color. Ageism segregates us. Feeling alienated from older people and apprehensive at becoming like us is not natural. Watch out for that word. It is not inevitable. These values are socially constructed, which is a fancy way of saying we make them up and we can unmake them and make new values. Age segregation cuts us off from most of humanity. An age-mixed world is straight up a better world for about 1 million reasons that are intuitively obvious. So in our lifetimes, for the first time in human history, 4, even 5 living generations will become commonplace. The rules and institutions around us were created when lives were shorter, and they have yet to catch up. So this gives us a critical window of opportunity to tap into the social capital of millions more healthy, well-educated adults than ever before, and shape a world that supports people of all ages, right? Young people too. We all need different kinds of support all the way along the lifespan, and those lifespans are going to be longer. So how do we get there? A couple of suggestions. First of all, tap into what we know, we olders know, aging enriches us. Growing older isn't just different from what we've been brainwashed to believe, it's way better. It is not that the losses aren't real. I'm no positive aging Pollyanna, but aging brings confidence, perspective, self-awareness. That's why I've never met anyone who actually wants to go back to their youth. No, you can't just swap out the parts that don't work so well, because we know that our years are what make us us. Another suggestion, look more generously at each other and at ourselves. Entire industries are built on convincing people that my 69-year-old face and body are hideous, that old equals ugly, especially for women. But a system designed to exploit our insecurities can only work if we agree to it. Instead of muttering, what the hell happened at the face in the mirror, and we all have those moments, How about taking a minute to recall some of the things that did happen and how amazing they were? Let's not delude ourselves. This is the work of a lifetime. We need to embark on it with others and with all ages, but none of this stigma is natural and none of it is fixed. We can insist on being seen and being valued as our full, rich, lumpy, complicated selves and take that change and that sense of ourselves out into the world. Also incredibly important, ask for help. Autonomy requires collaborators. That's one of my favorite quotes from a Dutch gerontologist named Jan Bars. No one is ever independent, ever. We're social creatures. All of life is interdependence. And of course, these are two-way, mutually gratifying transactions. It's not like one person is doing all the getting and the other the giving. So let's reach for helping hands gracefully and without shame and ask for help. And make friends of all ages, also really important. If you don't know many people much older or younger than you, think of something you like to do and find a mixed age group to do it with. Don't stay home just because you'll stick out. And of course, younger people benefit too, because otherwise each generation has to figure out on its own just how dumb and destructive it is to fear getting older and how much of our youth we waste on worrying about it. And last but not least, join forces. Dismantling ageism is going to take nothing less than a mass movement like the 20th century movement that catalyzed a mass shift of consciousness and power and identity for women around the world. And women came together and shared their stories and realized that what they had been thinking of as personal problems, like not getting hired or heard or getting harassed, were actually widely shared social and political problems that we could come together and do something about. That shift in awareness is the linchpin of movement building. Change is underway around the world. If you don't believe me, check out the campaign section of the Old School Clearinghouse that Remus mentioned. Oldschool.info is the website. We didn't even have that section when we started it 3 years ago, and it is growing fast and furiously. Changing the culture is a tall order, but culture is fluid. Look at the remarkable process we have made on gay and trans rights in just a few decades. Until we put a stop to it, ageism will oppress us all. But here's the thing, none of this happens without the inner work that Connie Zweig is going to tell us about, because we can't challenge bias until we're aware of it, and because all change starts within. Connie, over to you.
Thanks so much. That was a great, energized summary of this critical issue and this dilemma that we all face. And I really honor your efforts here, Ashton. I really respect the work you're doing. I want to take a few minutes with you all to kind of build the bridge, as she said, between our inner work and our outer work. Our psychology and our social justice or activism work. So I'm going to set up a PowerPoint to walk through this with you. And I also want to say that I'm really grateful to the Encore Network for having the three of us and to all of the sponsoring organizations who supported this work. I want to take a few minutes. Oh, so here I noticed that the images of the panelists are blocking my script. Okay, I've got to change gears. Give me a moment.
We're told that we're able to change when we're old, so why can't we start here?
Yeah, let me call on my flexibility here. So I want to take a few minutes to explore the material from my new book, which Rick mentioned, The Inner Work of Age. And it extends my body of work on the shadow into late life for people who are 50 plus and wish to continue their development alongside their longevity. So Ashton gave us a really sweeping framework to see how collective ageism is the soup in which we swim. And her advocacy for institutional change is crucial for all generations. I want to flip the picture for a moment as a depth psychologist, I want to suggest that we also need to examine ageism from the inside out, and what we now call internalized ageism, which Ashton mentioned. And like racism, internalized ageism can't be legislated away. And that's because it's primarily unconscious, residing in the shadow. So what is the shadow? Carl Jung, eminent psychiatrist, coined this term to refer to the personal unconscious. The shadow develops in each of us as children as we identify with socially acceptable traits, like, let's say your parents taught you to be polite or generous or caretaking. And we do that to find love and approval from them. And in this way, we form a conscious ego and we banish the opposite traits like rudeness, stinginess, and self-centeredness into the unconscious shadow. So the ego and the shadow develop in tandem. If our sadness is shamed, it's exiled into the shadow. If our anger is punished, it's banished too. If our musical artistic talent is dismissed or undervalued, guess what happens? It gets repressed and buried into the shadow. And because the shadow is beneath our threshold of awareness, we can't gaze at it. It's like a blind spot in our field of vision. So even though these unacceptable feelings and images and desires lie dormant in the shadow, they often erupt later in life in hurtful and self-destructive behavior, like lying, cheating, addiction, and projections of all kinds, like ageism, which Ashton described so well, and racism and homophobia and anti-immigrant bias. And, you know, we see the shadows of politicians erupt every day these days. So with shadow work, we learn how to listen to the cues that the shadow is erupting. The inner voices, physical sensations, and subtle feelings. And if we ignore or deny them, then the shadow leads us to do the same things we've always done without the results we want. So if we have a habit of criticizing a spouse, and we don't know why, it keeps popping up, we'll keep doing it until we uncover the shadow figure and its deeper needs. Why is it doing that? So the shadow is like a dark room in which our feelings, dreams, and images lie dormant. And shadow work is like the process of development from the dark room in which they come back to life. So what's the shadow in the context of age? I'm going to see if I can move these pictures and get my text here. No, I can't. Oh yes, wait a minute, I can't. Okay. So let's talk about the shadow in the context of age. Most of us learn that being independent, quick, and productive are highly valued and result in rewards of approval and status. On the other hand, we learn that their opposite traits, dependent, slow, unproductive, and weak, are devalued and result in disapproval and shame. And so we dread the loss of those traits as we age, as we slow down and do less and need others more. If our images of and our associations with aging remain outside of our awareness, then we're blind to them. Like my 80-year-old friend who said he didn't want to be with old people because he wasn't like them. We deny our reality and we reject a part of ourselves. So I want to pause for just a moment and ask you this question. You know, in Ashton's opening, she asked us, what are our associations with old? So I want to ask you, what stereotypes, fantasies, and images are you carrying about age? And when we learn to establish a conscious relationship with those parts of ourselves that are outside of awareness, we can attune to the many voices and detect those that can be guides for us now and those that can sabotage our dreams. We can slow down, turn within, and open to what's calling us without dismissing it. That's what I call romancing the shadow. We can expand our awareness and deepen our self-knowledge to include that which has been excluded for us, a deferred dream, a secret desire, a hidden talent. And we may even reclaim something precious that was buried in the shadow long ago. We meet the shadows of age in many ways. It acts out indirectly in a sarcastic remark, like, I can't believe she wore that at her age. We meet the shadow in a projection onto another person, attributing to them something that's in a blind spot in ourselves. And that's how we create an other. So today we're exploring projection onto older adults, known as ageism. And we're meeting a part of ourselves that's participating in that, projecting that target onto others. And even more secretly, onto ourselves as we age. Let me tell you a story. The California potter, Beatrice Wood, wrote a piece about discovering her inner ageist at age 90. She said, I know the absurdity of old age because I've always hated old people ever since I was young. And then I had to go to the hospital and found myself in a room with a toothless old hag who wouldn't let me rest. I was not nice to her until I realized she needed someone. She had a heart attack and was alone and frightened. So I whipped myself into decency. I told her I would speak to the doctor and call her every day. And when I sat on her bed and took her hand, to my astonishment, this ugly old woman became beautiful. There was no wall between us. I called her the next day, and she had died during the night. But I was sure that she died knowing that someone cared. So now you see the arrogance of the artist who didn't want to be disturbed by the old lady. And I threw that into the ash can and met another human being. And this was one of the most important lessons of my life, unquote. So I don't have time to teach you shadow work now, but my chapter on the inner ageist will guide you to discover whether this hidden part of yourselves is leading to denial, lack of self-acceptance, and projection onto others. Here's why it's so important. It turns out that what we believe about age throughout our lives shapes how we age in later years. And Ashton mentioned the research by Becca Levy at Yale University because it's really startling. She has spent decades uncovering the effects on our brains, minds, and bodies, on our emotional and mental health, on memory and will to live, and even longevity, the effects of our unconscious beliefs and fears that are in the shadow about growing old. And she also found that when we have a positive internal attitude and we reject collective ageism and make a conscious relationship with our inner ageist shadow, we can shape life differently as a vital stage of adult development for continuing our emotional and spiritual growth, cultivating our wisdom, and contributing to future generations. We can make the shift that I call from role to soul, deepening our identity and becoming models of aging well for others. So this is the promise of the inner work of age. We can find self-acceptance and authenticity. We can shift our identity from role to soul and find new meaning and direction in late life. We can serve something larger than ourselves. We can change archetypes from senior to elder. And we can honor the nobility and gifts of other elders and this community. My book was just published 2 weeks ago, and the inner ageist is just one of many shadow characters you'll meet. So if you choose to take this journey with me. So thanks. And now we're going to have a conversation about the link between this inner work and the activism work of fighting ageism.
I love it. I love it. And I love it especially because of this link question. And the reason why Ashton Applewhite, who I knew of before I ever met her, but we had her as a speaker, our keynote speaker at one of our positive aging conferences. We had some great people at the, Mary Catherine Bateson was a speaker. Mark Friedman, Encore Network, he was a speaker. So I never met Ashton Applewhite. So the night before she was to come and give her speech, I had a dream. And in my dream, I was 70 years old at the time, but I was applying to medical school. And I was talking to the dean and he'd rejected me. And I kept fighting and arguing and saying, no, you got to understand, I'm really qualified. It was a very powerful dream. And when I woke up, I realized, wait a minute, maybe the inner ageist is in me. I wasn't sure, but
it's your dream, Rick.
It was my dream, and all the characters in the dream were from me. So I guess my question to both of you is, do we have to wait to meet the inner ageist in a dream or to meet the real Ashton Applewhite in a Zoom call? What do we do? What's our next step for all of us? Anybody jump in? I really want an answer to that question.
That's one for Connie.
Okay. I don't think we need to wait for anything. I think it's actually dangerous now for us to wait, as 10,000 people turn 65 every single day in our country.
That's true.
So, I wrote this book because I couldn't find literature from a depth psychological perspective on aging, which means how is the unconscious affecting us, affecting our fears and beliefs and attitudes. And then I had this experience of meeting my own inner ageist, which I tell in the book. So what I would suggest, and Ashton may have a different way of looking at this, but what I would suggest is that we begin to attune to ourselves, listen to our inner dialogue when we're with older people. You may be surprised by an attitude that comes up, by a fear that comes up. Also, think about who were models of older people in your early childhood. I didn't have a single model of an elder who was thriving and creative and enjoying life. Not one. And so when I'm with my grandkids now, I'm aware that they're internalizing aging in a different way just from being with me. My 10-year-old grandson told me on Sunday he's so excited that I made a book. That was his language. And so he's having a different internal experience of what it means to grow old. So my suggestion is that we find a way in our individual lives to increase our own self-awareness about the unconscious issues, the conscious issues, what it is we're modeling and communicating, what we might be projecting onto others. How about you, Ashton?
I love that. I mean, I think, perhaps there's a perceived polarity between your point of view and mine, but in fact, it's the same task, but approached in different ways and with a different vocabulary. People ask me all the time a wonderful question, how can I get started? Where do I begin? Which
Yeah,
is a
that's my
version of the
question.
question you asked, Rick. Yeah. And I often say, look at your own attitudes towards age and aging, starting with something super simple, like think about how you use the words old and young. People say, I don't feel old. What they really mean is I don't feel invisible. I don't feel ugly. I don't feel incompetent. All things I felt more acutely at age 13, honest to God, than I have ever felt since. But if we don't, most bias is unconscious. And if we don't see it, we can't challenge it. So, and I really meant what I said at the end of my remarks. Without that as the catalyst, nothing happens. We stay in stasis, whether it's individual or collective.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I love the fact that when you were talking about Becca Levy, who I actually have met, you said you get out of jail, and instead of get out of jail, said, well, as it happens, I went to Yale. And when I think back to my undergraduate years, that's the last place I want to go back to. I feel like I got out of jail from a certain point of view, but I also feel somewhat imprisoned. I was also intrigued by something that you said about, if I got this right, Ashton, about the need to challenge some of the practices that we're involved in. I follow you every day, Ashton. You don't know this, but I follow you every day on Twitter, okay? I'm constantly getting, but then I think to myself, oh, wait a minute. I've only sent one Twitter message in my entire life, even though I'm on Twitter. And I begin to feel I'm old. I'm 76. I'm like an immigrant in a foreign country.
Well, that's why I tweet. I tweet to make you feel bad.
Make me feel bad. I actually feel better by reading the things that you say, and eventually I'll start tweeting myself. I took a whole course on how to tweet. I took the course, but I didn't do it. So that's my problem with the inner ageism.
Well, let's say something about technology and older people, because
let's talk about that. We're using a technology here, and I think we're using it productively. It's limited. There's only 3 of us on the call, but there's, I think, 600 people listening to this conversation. That's a good thing. I'm not trying to criticize Twitter either. I'm just trying to make this point that sometimes elders, speaking for myself, feel a little bit like immigrants in a foreign country. I mean, exactly what about this TikTok stuff and all the rest of it? I feel.
But I think we learn what we need to learn.
Okay.
And, I am completely self-made. I had no background. I had no professional affiliations, et cetera, et cetera. And it was pretty obvious that I needed to, work to create a social media persona, if you will, in order to get my message out there. And it's 15 years. I'm a bit of a technophobe. I would not have had to do it if it were not essential to my livelihood. I think no matter how old we are, if we have to learn, nuclear physics to feed our kids or pay our rent, we're going to learn it.
Right.
You didn't, I don't mean to sound presumptive, but you did not need to tweet. You
It's
didn't
true.
have it. And therefore, but if someone had said, the health of your, spouse or whatever hinges on whether you learn to tweet, you'd be tweeting like crazy.
You're absolutely right. If they plunked me down in the middle of Serbo-Croatia, I would start speaking something in Serbian.
I think there's another level of motivation, which is that at this stage of life, some of us really want to give back and contribute. Our lifetime of learning. And so when I realized that I was going to write another book, which was not planned, it was not expected, I realized that I had to learn social media. And it was very intimidating. And what I did was I talked to this 17-year-old girl across the street and asked her to mentor me. And so we had this intergenerational series of meetings, and she got me through the click phobia that had been paralyzing me. And so I'm really grateful that there was this exchange and that there was this motivation behind it for me to get my message out. I didn't need it financially, but I needed, if I was going to spend 4 years working on a book and to leave a legacy, I needed to be able to reach people. And I think there are many people at this stage of life which we don't even have a name for. You know, this extended longevity is unprecedented in human history. We've never had so long.
That is true.
From retirement to the end of life before. So there are many people who want to contribute and serve and give back to the common good. And for some reason, it looks like it's dependent on technology now. Now, I don't think that's the only way. I think there are actually, and as the pandemic slows down and gets easier to go outside, we can join communities and engage in different ways.
Yeah.
But it's a shame if we let that stop us.
Yeah, I like that. I agree with that. I was also interested in that example that Connie, you gave of the blind spot, because I think of a blind spot in driving. And the problem with the blind spot is I don't know that it's there. I can't see the blind spot. And I look, but the blind spot prevents me from seeing it. So I have to use another reflector. So you're talking about intergenerational ties as a way of, in a sense, in letting us see what we don't yet see.
Well, most people don't know about the shadow. They don't know that there's a blind spot in their body-mind system because they're unaware of it.
Yeah.
And so in the context of age, they don't know about internalized ageism because it's in the shadow. They can't see the inner ageist, and they can't see how it's affecting them.
Mm-hmm.
And how it's affecting other people because of their attitudes. So it's a blind spot in that sense. When we're driving and we turn our heads over our shoulder to catch the blind spot, we suddenly realize there's a car there.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens.
And so with shadow work, we learn how to recognize there's a shadow figure there that's sabotaging us. And then it recedes again, just like the car, you know, the shadow is very slippery.
Well, let me turn that back to Ashton now, because this has social consequences. If just as with racism, if people are blind and they say, I'm not a racist, they may not see certain things about zoning patterns or finances, other things that are more invisible. So how do we deal with that blind spot in our society? If we don't see that we don't see it,
Well,
what do we do?
You know, that is the hardest part. I am constantly telling people the most necessary, important part is to look at your own attitudes and to acknowledge your own bias, because without that, we are like, you know, ostriches. The person who says I'm not racist, or maybe, you know, a little bit more evolved, I'm colorblind. I don't see color. I don't see race. Well, if you don't see race, you don't see racism. What I tell people is that is the most unpleasant moment, is acknowledging, holy crap, I am biased. And in that sense, I'm part of the problem. I love when people say of my book, oh, you know, that's the first comment. Yikes, I didn't realize that I was part of the problem. The wonderful thing is that it is like letting a genie out of a bottle. Once you see it in yourself, you start to see it in the world around you. That is like the analogous to the process I described about consciousness racing. You start to see, oh, it's not my fault for doing this wrong, or, you know, not being strong enough or educated enough. It is a social and cultural problem that is manifest in billboards, in, you know, in the luncheon queue, everywhere. And that is liberating. There's even a really geeky term for it, and I'm eager for Connie's take on it, which speaks to both the activist and the nerd in me, so I love it. Cognitive liberation.
Cognitive liberation.
And that is the linchpin of movement building, which is interesting in some way. I hope Connie can parse.
Yeah, that's very good.
I've never been asked to parse.
Parse away.
So it seems to me that some people more easily see the isms on the outside. They more easily see people suffering, and they examine why. So for example, during the pandemic, there was a lot of negative commentary about people in nursing homes. You know, even anchors on television, it was all kind of negative commentary. That can wake people up to the social thinking, cognition, beliefs, and then be a reflection on their own. Do I think that way? Wait a minute. They got discomfort perhaps because they recognize they are participating in it. Other people who are more introverted have a more natural inclination to self-reflect, maybe do shadow work, find it internally first, and then have this wake-up call, oh my God, it's all around me. If it's inside of me and I'm projecting it onto other older people, then other people are doing the same thing. And that's why the institutions are ageist. That's why the media, I mean, one of the things I really uncovered in myself when I was writing the book was all of the messages I received in childhood from the media, from television. Remember All in the Family and Archie Bunker's comments to his wife? So the media can wake us up to what we believe and what we're thinking and our whole inner dialogue about older people. If we stop and really listen, did I just hear that? Did I just hear that patronizing comment in that movie that tens of millions of people are seeing? So I think that we can wake up or become aware of our internal dialogue and our beliefs, both from the outside in and from the inside out. And this is a kind of very individual journey. It could also be a friend who said, wow, that's a biased comment, and mirrors for you that inner ageist in yourself. So the link that we want to talk about between the inner work and the outer work is in a way, I think, a false dichotomy, Ashton, because we're all, there is no inner and outer, right? We internalize the outer world. We act out that internalization in the social world. And this inner and outer thing is a split that we think we're living because we experience ourselves as separate from others, as separate from nature, as separate from social institutions, right?
Separate from each other.
As separate from each other. And we feel that isolation, because of that. So I think the link is really a really important message for us to offer. And that the separation is in a way an illusion.
One more binary bites the dust.
Yes.
Excellent. My working title for this whole project at one point was Binaries Are Bad.
Binaries are bad.
And, from the spiritual point of view, I'd say duality is a myth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Different words for the same thing.
Yeah.
Perhaps. But I love that idea of yikes, the moments of yikes, when the person says, wow. And that wonderful example, I've forgotten which one of you gave it, of Beatrice Wood, actually, whose work is very, very important. But she's 90 years old and she's still learning. But what is she learning? She's learning to help the person right next to her. And I was reminded of the Dalai Lama's statement, be kind whenever possible.
Yes.
It is always possible.
Yes.
It is always possible.
It is always possible.
And maybe this struggle or this effort to face up to the dream in me, this ageism inside out, I think is the title of our whole session this morning. This is really pointing me back to myself, pointing all of us back there. We've had a number of really compelling questions in the question and answer period. I'm afraid I haven't even been able to pay a lot of attention to them. So Remus, if you want to come back, and if there's any of these questions that are compelling, I'd like to urge you to pick ones that seem important. This is my problem always. I tend to like all restaurants, all foods, all movies. And I look at all the questions, they all look good to me. So
I think you and I are the same, Harry. There are a lot of wonderful questions, and just a reminder, if people have questions that they want to ask, please enter them into the Q&A. You'll see that little Q&A icon on the screen. We'll try to answer as many as possible. Just for those who were wondering, yes, the session is being recorded, and we'll send you all a link to that recording a few days from now. And also we'll include information. A lot of people are asking about the Becca Levy study that was done.
Yeah,
So
very
we'll
nice.
try to
Many
include a link.
studies,
Yeah.
many,
so we'll
many
try-
studies, a whole decade of them. I summarized them in the book on the inner ages.
Yeah.
And
Great.
I just posted a link in the.
Oh,
in the-
great.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So that'll be very helpful, and we'll send a link to everybody. So one question came up. Rosemary wrote that she's very interested in the role of language and what we call ourselves. And I noticed Ashton referred to olders, and Rick, you referred to elders.
Yep.
So just throwing it out to all three of you, what should we call ourselves? Should we call ourselves anything? And what are your thoughts on that?
You should call yourself whatever you want. There are no right answers here or wrong answers. In my experience, no one likes senior. I came up with olders and youngers as nouns when I was writing my book because I literally got tired of typing older people or older Americans. I like it because elder is not part of my cultures and it is an honorific, and so it's a little alien to me. I know it's a beautiful word. Tons of people use it. I love encountering it. I don't feel as comfortable using it because it's not value neutral. And I don't think older people have more value than younger people. I don't think younger people are juniors. And I like olders and youngers because people know what they mean and they emphasize, it breaks that binary, right? There's no more old,
Yeah.
young binary because it emphasizes that we age in relation to others. A 4-year-old will assure you that she is older than her 2-year-old sister, and Mrs. So-and-so
true.
in room 12 will assure you she is younger than Mrs. McGillicuddy down
That's
the
right.
hall. So
That's
it
true,
enables
too.
you to inhabit, we're back to duality. It enables you to inhabit both older and younger, be both of those things at any point in your life, depending on who you're in context with.
Sounds like we've made language into comfort food, comfort language, whatever makes us feel good. What about you, Connie?
Olders and youngers, it works.
Okay, what about you, Connie? You have any insights on this?
Well, my work is about development, psychological development. And so for me, I'm trying to describe and offer practices and tools for people to make an internal shift from senior to elder or from role to soul. And so I used elder because it's distinguished from senior, which is automatic in our culture on a Medicare birthday. And as Ashton said, it's pejorative because we live in an ageist culture. But an elder is someone who is intentional. An elder is a stage, not an age. And it actually asks of us that we do this inner work. We do emotional repair. We do a life review. We do spiritual reevaluation. We do practices to become an elder so that it's like a rite of passage, which our culture doesn't offer us. I mean,
we need new rites and rites of passage for these longer
Yes.
lives, Connie. I couldn't agree more.
yes. And so, in our indigenous culture, that's available. But in the general white Western world, we don't have that rite of passage. And that's part of what I was trying to create in the book so that people had a guide to become an elder.
Yeah. I see Remus is not with us. Maybe he's still with us, but
I'm listening.
another Y chromosome joins the group. And what I want to mention here is that it's kind of a joke about this. Why are there 6 million sperm, but only 1 egg? Answer: the sperm won't ask for directions. And there is a problem with men growing older. There are fewer of us the older we get, number one. But number two, we often don't ask for directions. And I mean that in the global sense, because it means acknowledging I don't know, somebody needs to help me, all this kind of stuff. And I plead guilty to all these qualities. I'm exactly that way. I ask more directions than my wife, as it turns out, but that's just a trivial thing. When it comes to this sense of independence, invulnerability, I'll do it myself. I'm right up there with the others, and I don't know how to even confront that. I've only recently become aware of it. Just wanted to share that.
Well, when I interviewed hundreds of people, I found that, and this is a generalization, so it may not be true for you individuals, But I found that men who were aging in later life were more afraid of losing their independence and becoming
Yes.
dependent.
Yes.
And becoming dependent means asking for help.
Yes.
And
Yes.
women were more afraid of losing their image and their attractiveness in general. This is
Yeah, well,
again,
in Western culture, we value doing over being. Women
That's
age
right.
successfully by appearing to not age. Men age successfully by continuing to act like younger people.
Right.
Can I bring up another?
Please. You're
binary?
right on target here.
Dependent, independent, right?
Yes.
That's another bogus binary. We all
Bogus
need help.
binaries. Bogus
We
binaries.
all need help lifelong. I mean, every time, I mean, I'm like on the fringe here, I'm aware of that, but you know, there's so much emphasis around aging independently, and it sets us up to fail, right? And it shames us when we fall short, as we inevitably do. And that burden falls disproportionately on men because of the awful roles that patriarchy sets up for men. Worse for women, but also men. You know, it impoverishes men, toxic masculinity. So everyone suffers. Women actually have an advantage when it comes to this, you know, to aging because of this, and because we have stronger social connections, which is a separate topic, but the most important component of a good old age.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah. Any other questions, Remus, that leaped out? One of our listeners talked about language, and I think our two speakers have tried to address that, maybe in different ways, but that's important. Other questions that leap out to you?
Sure, there was a good number of them. One is, you know, and Connie, you talked about the inner work we should be doing, and Ashton shared some great things that we could do as individuals, combat ageism. So, but I think a lot of us have been raised to be somewhat self-deprecating and humble. And so what about the remarks we all make ourselves? Somebody pointed out that, is the question, am I dating myself, ageist? Or is it just being honest and realist? So in terms of our own way of referring to ourselves and our age, et cetera, any advice, thoughts, suggestions as we try to struggle with
Ashton,
it?
we're looking for guidance here. We really are.
Think about the tone in which someone says that. If you say, oh, I was around, I remember when that show came up on TV, it's neutral or positive. If you say, oh, that dates me, which is almost invariably how we say it. We say it in a tone of self-deprecation or embarrassment.
Mm-hmm.
In that case, it is ageist, because we are saying, oh, it's a bad thing to have been around that long.
Right. So the tone of voice is crucial. Mm-hmm.
I like the term 72 years of life experience. Because for me, I'm valuing the privilege of this long life that I've had.
Mm-hmm.
So for people who feel ashamed of being 72, then it comes out differently. As Ashton is saying, it comes out with charge, emotional charge. It comes out with fear and trepidation.
Or just neutral. This is how old I am.
Yeah. Right.
And
want to
speaking of
reclaim
which,
that.
So somebody asked about what about when people say, I don't feel this old?
What does the word really mean? What actual feeling or experience are they referencing? Use that instead, because age has nothing to do with it unless the person is a child. It's age irrelevant. We pin every ache and pain on age without thinking, the gag line in my TED Talk, my other knee doesn't hurt and it's just as old. Or is it because we helped a kid move, or we just are gloomy that day? We automatically pin so much stuff on age when age is typically irrelevant. Those emotions, Connie, name me an emotion that you can feel as a teenager that you can't feel as an adult.
None.
But I want to probe your example of my left knee feels just as old as the right one, because I have a friend who broke her hip a few weeks ago. And the other day she said to me, she happens to be 74 years old. And the other day she said to me, I feel like I'm 84. I feel like I've aged 10 years with the broken hip. Not from this is not somebody with a negative attitude towards aging, but the literature does suggest that people who experience negative life events, physical life events, tend to all of a sudden say, well, wait a minute, I'm older than I thought I was.
But
I
what
don't know
she
what we do
feels
with
is frail. What she feels is vulnerable.
Yeah,
What she feels is ill. We can feel all those things at any stage. Physical decline is inevitable, but she doesn't actually, she says she feels older because, and that's how she feels. I'm not to deny her experience, but there are plenty of 84-year-olds out there moving around just fine on two hips. There are plenty of 50-year-olds who need hip replacements. So that's an example of taking age out of it, right? What she
Very good.
feels is vulnerable and that's totally understandable, but age, not because of how old she is, because of what's happening inside her body.
Yeah.
I would suggest that there's an invisible standard in that she's comparing to.
Mm-hmm.
She's comparing 74 to 84 because of the collective attitude toward 84.
Yes.
Yeah.
Agreed. There is no typical, the doctors, this old saying, and I've heard doctors say it, if you've seen one 80-year-old, you've seen one, right? And again, this idea that as we age at different rates, cognitively, physically, developmentally, spiritually, for sure. So that the older the person is, the less that number tells you about what they're capable of or interested in.
Very good. Very good. Other comments or questions that you
Sure.
found in the.
There are a lot of questions or comments about how society makes us feel. It expresses ageism. The media, advertising, entertainment.
Right.
But there are a number of questions about age discrimination in the workplace. And in fact, I just had a conversation with somebody yesterday who felt that they had experienced that. So, what advice, thoughts, suggestions in terms of age discrimination for those people who are looking for work or trying to keep their job? Or your thoughts on it?
It's, as somebody who worked for AARP for many years, I will tell you that it's good to fight it, but don't expect to win the lawsuit anytime soon, because the lawsuits are hard to win on this subject, unfortunately.
Connie, what's your take?
Oh, I kind of feel this is your expertise. I mean, yeah, you go for it.
Well, I think that discrimination in the workforce is real. I also think it's where we are seeing cultural change because, newsflash, we live under capitalism where the productivity
It's just in.
where people are measured according to their conventional economic productivity.
Yeah.
So it is illegal. The more people speak up about it, track it. If it's your experience, it's almost certainly real and it's awful, especially discrimination in hiring, which older people it's harder for younger people to get a job. But if we olders lose a job, especially if we're women, even more if we're women of color and so on,
Absolutely true.
And the privilege of the job that we're looking for, it's a really steep hill. And if you can't pay your rent or feed your kids, the work that we are doing is icing. Let me say that, whatever you have to do to get a job, no judgment whatsoever. But if you feel that you are being discriminated against, take notes, document
Very good
it.
suggestion. Very good. Take notes.
Take it up with HR, human resources, if you can. A lot of groups, big companies now are forming employee resource groups, resource groups around a given identity, perhaps disability, perhaps race. Age groups are starting to happen. So perhaps you can, and ideally, they would not just be the old people. They would, young people experience a ton of age discrimination too. So we would talk about how age affects how people judge us instead of our own capacities. And, if more and more of us bring lawsuits, the big tech companies are starting to encounter and lose age discrimination suits. So change is happening. And the more of us are able to speak up and do speak up, the faster that change will occur. But no judgment if you cannot afford to do that.
Yeah. And AARP is very active in this area and continues to fight that fight.
So let me add another dimension. So fully agree with everything said here. And at the same time, retirement from the inside out, the shadow carries the fears and beliefs that we will become useless, invisible, irrelevant if we are forced out of work. So there's this unconscious emotional component that's going on underneath or behind the social, political, economic forces in the workplace. Now, again, this is a luxury for people who financially need to work. But what if you don't? What if you have financial security and you're forced into retirement and you thought you wanted to keep working, but the situation has changed? Then what? Then there's an opening, an invitation for something else, for life after retirement. And what might that look like? And so I just want to suggest that underneath, and I think all of the areas that we're talking about have, both of these dimensions that we're describing in the binary, right? There's the outer dimension of forced retirement, but there's the inner dimension of it too, the inner world, the internal fears and concerns that we're carrying with us. And this is an opportunity, again, if it's financially possible, to examine those, to self-reflect. I have a friend who recently was forced into retirement and said to me, I always wanted to write this novel. I mean, I actually have the time to do it now. I thought I never would. I have another friend who was forced into retirement in the publishing world. And she said, I'm painting. I can't believe I'm an artist. It's fantastic. So I'm not, again, romanticizing this because it's a terrible situation for many people, but I am saying it is an invitation to another stage of life.
And actually, the Encore Network has pioneered the promotion of the idea of encore careers.
Yes.
And I'm an example of that. I spend my time in retirement helping small nonprofits with fundraising. I don't do it, I don't get paid, but I do it because I believe in it.
Speaking of which, Rick, somebody asked about your monthly e-newsletter. They said they rave about it, and they suggested that you share more information about how people can subscribe.
If I put it, I'll just put my email address in the chat room. Can they read the chat room? Or can nobody read the chat room?
You could put it in the, well, we'll include it in the follow-up information.
Okay, hrmoody@yahoo.com. I'll send you a sample.
It's a fantastic newsletter.
So here's
I don't get paid for that either, by the way.
Right.
It's okay. It's okay. It's like in the example of Beatrice Wood, that wonderful example. Nobody's paying her. She's not getting recognized. The fact that she even wrote about it is sort of a strange thing. Many of the great acts that people perform, no act of love is ever wasted, as a colleague of mine put it in a book she wrote. And this is true for so many things that people do, and it's true for Encore careers too. So put my email in there and I'll be glad to send you a sample copy of the newsletter. You can become one of my 10,000 closest friends.
We definitely will.
I want to hear from our speakers, Ashton and Connie, in terms of how do we promote this kind of idea of giving back? I love that when you said that, Connie, about giving back, because that's what we're concerned with. We better be concerned about it.
Well, I think one thing that makes it impossible to think that way is fear. I think fear makes us stupid. Fear separates us. And I used to quote USC and AARP did a study, I think in 2017, that showed that more anxiety about aging is associated with less knowledge about the aging process. If I were a cynic, I would point out this is just, our fears are so awful that learning that it's 10% less terrible than you thought is itself good news. But the fact is, to a certain extent, that's true. Just learning about, all the information,
Yeah.
no one knows that dementia rates are falling. There's still tons of dementia because age is the biggest risk factor and there are more older people. But every time we worry that because we can't find our pencil, it means we're getting all sorts of Alzheimer's, that stress makes us more vulnerable to exactly what we fear. And it is really hard to think about working communally and, towards a higher goal and collaborating when we are afraid. And another thing ageism does is all prejudice pits groups against each other. In this case, old against young, and that's not where we're not going to undo any of these biases if we don't work together. So that is also, I come at this, I am the least self-reflective person in the world. So I tend to come at it from this sort of very secular perspective.
That's not true.
But
you're very self-reflective. I see it because I read your tweets. Okay. I read them all the time.
It's all one struggle though, right? It's all
struggle.
one way in, and just as we know from the idea of intersectionality, that all these forms of bias combine and reinforce each other, so do different forms of activism. When we chip away at any of this shadow stuff in whatever domain about whatever we think is wrong with us or lacking in us, and take that awareness into the world, we chip away at the fear and ignorance that underlies all bias and that divides us and fills us with needless fears.
Yeah, very good. I just checked the question and answers, and I see we're up to like 96 different questions. I feel like the internet. I'm overwhelmed. Remus, help me out. What are the questions that we need to be paying attention to?
Sure. There's quite a few. There's a good number that kind of cover physical attractiveness and aging and self-worth, et cetera. And so comments about that in terms of, should people feel guilty if they're trying to look younger?
They dye their hair,
et cetera. How do, comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah.
The best piece of advice I got when I was writing my book was don't use the word should. So I didn't.
Good advice. That's very good advice.
Connie, let me just rant for a second and then I'll hand the mic over to you. There are so many people out there telling people what to do, especially women, especially about how we should look, and again, this is an utterly individual process. We have to negotiate these transitions in the best way we can, in the best way that works for us. And focusing on women's appearance, Susan Sontag called it the double standard of aging, that we are punished for visible signs of aging. And consciousness raising was the tool that catalyzed the women's movement. A short plug for the Old School Clearinghouse, oldschool.info, contains hundreds of free resources, one of which is the 4-day-old guide to, it's called Ageist, Sexist, Who Me? Because it means looking at our internalized bias of both kinds. Get together, start a consciousness raising group, and look at these attitudes and the hooks they get inside our brains, right? And that's how we undo them and say, you know what? My appearance is actually not the most important thing about me, and we need to support each other. Who are the harshest critics of how women look? Other women, right? So we need to work on this collectively and slowly. It is the work of a lifetime, but boy, it's worth it, because once you start to see it in yourself, you see it in the world. Connie.
Yes, the work of a lifetime.
So, my orientation is, again, internal development, but this term cognitive liberation really fits in here, because I feel free of how other people look at me now. I feel free of any negative gaze about my wrinkles or my figure or my hair is graying. I feel free of that.
Beautiful.
So here's what I want to suggest, and it's not a should, because everybody does this differently. But for me, there's a kind of spiritual work that we can do in this stage of life if we're oriented that way. if we're oriented towards self-reflection and contemplation, meditation, any
Mhm.
spiritual practice, we can begin to move our attention from where we're stuck in our identity. And let's say it's about forced retirement and we're no longer a salesperson. Or let's say it's about beauty and image and we no longer look the way we used to look, because that's what happens. Then we can begin to move our attention from
Mhm.
that identity, which is deeply unconscious. You know, I am attractive and that makes me powerful and that makes people want to be with me and blah, blah, blah. So we can begin to move that toward a more essential spiritual identity. And whatever name we give to that, whether we call it soul or something else, higher self, God within, whatever, the language doesn't matter. But this shift from role or image to soul, for me, is the best promise of this stage of life, the treasure of this stage of life. And it gives us purpose
Yeah.
in terms of our own development, and it gives us purpose in terms of how we are in the world, how we present ourselves, and how other people then view someone who's in late life. So I love that, you know, for me, this is the promise. And it's not because I'm a meditator, it's not because I'm an introvert, it isn't any of that. It's possible for anyone who wants to take the time and the energy to be contemplative, to do a practice that silences the mind. Because if the mind is always noisy, then you really can't connect with yourself, with your deeper self. So if you learn how to silence the mind and sit in the silence and watch your thoughts, which are all the voices of shadow characters, then you can begin to turn your attention to this deeper identity. And you go beyond physical image and you go beyond doing as who you are, beyond productivity or success or accomplishment or appearance. And so that's kind of, I know it's a challenging message. And for those of you who are listening right now, if you attune to what you're saying to yourself, you'll probably catch the voice of a shadow saying, oh, that's not for me. That's too hard. That's for her. That's not for me. And if you catch that in this moment, you can recognize that you're sabotaging yourself and that there's a part of you that's denying this possibility. And I just want to put out the invitation that this is possible for everyone.
One more question, Rick?
I feel that this answer is the best possible answer
It's so
because
beautiful.
David Orr put it this way: hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. And from my standpoint, this inner work is really inside out. It's the beginning of the outer work. And if we do the outer instead of doing the inner, or the inner instead of doing the outer, we're getting into that bogus binary again. And that's what we have to avoid at all costs. And that's why I so much appreciate what Remus, what you have done at PSS and what the Encore Network is doing. There are many, many people. The fact that there are 600 people listening to this today, there are more people out there who are interested in this kind of movement than we had any idea. And I think we should never underestimate the potential there. Never underestimate the potential. That's not a question. That's just my optimism. What can I say?
So we have a chance for a final comment from each of you to close this up. And what I thought I'd do is ask all three of you instead of Harry asking the two of you, but we just heard some great suggestions and some great thoughts shared. There's hundreds of people that are on this webinar. What can we do to challenge ageism when we see it? some practical things that we could do as individuals, because you have hundreds of people who can go out after hearing this and be inspired to do something. What can we do to challenge ageism when we see it, especially like in the media or in society?
What you
Ashton,
do
you wanna
depends on the
begin?
context. Sure. I mean, if you see it in the newspaper, then write a letter to the editor. People read letters to the
That's
editor.
it.
It changes things. If someone says something ageist to you and you can never come up with a snappy answer at the moment, a really good all-purpose answer is, what do you mean by that? You know, aren't you retired? What do you mean by that? Without being snarky, right? Because you don't want to
Yeah.
put someone on the defensive, but you want to make people reflect for a minute on what did they mean by that. And I will just say, last but not least, we created the Old School Clearinghouse, which has hundreds of free resources in every format you can imagine, from infographics to
Yeah,
webinars, consciousness raising guides. Noodle around, everything is free
go see
except the
it. It's
books.
great. It's
And
great.
find your tool, find your tribe.
Yeah.
Thanks. And thank you so much to Encore and PSS for having me tonight. And Connie, thanks for making this happen.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that was well said. I'm just going to echo that message and thank you all with deep gratitude to all of you.
Harry?
I've had the great good fortune of knowing a few people who created institutions that changed the world. Marty Knowlton, who invented Elder Hostel, and I was on the board. I was chairman of the board of Elder Hostel, now known as Rhodes Scholar, and Dame Cicely Saunders, who created hospice. I knew these people personally, and I was amazed as I looked at what they created. It changed the world. It didn't eliminate all problems in the world. We still have people dying badly. We still have older people who don't get the learning that they want. But they created institutions. And I love, Ashton, that you spoke about old school. And I love the books that the two of you have written. This is the beginning. It's not even the beginning, it's the continuation of something much bigger than the people on this call, much bigger than the three of us, much bigger than the 600 who are listening. And we should never lose hope in the ability of small numbers of people, as Margaret Mead put it so well, to change the world. It's happened throughout time. It can happen again.
Beautiful, Rick.
Every tiny step, every little thing you do shifts the culture a tiny bit.
Absolutely. Absolutely right.
And if our message resonates with you, join us and take this on as your purpose in this stage of life.
Absolutely right.
I love it. I love it. That's a perfect conclusion. I got to tell you. So, hey,
It's
I want to
sincere.
thank.
What can I
It's
say?
sincere, yeah, and you actually mean it. So, no.
Yes.
So thank you, Ashton and Connie and Harry. Our sincerest thanks to all of you for sharing your insights and spending time today with us to address this important issue. I invite all of those listening to visit our speakers' websites, get their books, subscribe to their e-newsletters and social media. I can't think of a better way to stay abreast of this important topic. Before we go, just a few reminders. We're going to send everybody a recording of this program in the next few days. And we have an upcoming event. Next slide. On October 19th, Encore Network is going to be presenting a webinar on Meet the Journalists, where we're going to have some key journalists that are probably familiar to a lot of you. They're from Next Avenue, et cetera, that are going to be talking. So hopefully you can all attend that. And then a huge thanks, next slide, to our 9 organizations that partnered with us, the Encore Network today. We hope you have a chance to visit all of their websites and learn more about them. A lot of them are doing the kind of work that you're interested in. So we'd like to thank them and encourage you all to visit them on their online. And we're going to do a really quick poll for everybody. We're going to try to bring that up. And if you could just take a minute before you all leave, how much of what you learned today will be valuable to you going forward? So just choose one and then hit submit in the lower right. How much of what you learned today will be valuable to you going forward? We're going to capture all of that. We appreciate your feedback. We're so glad you can join us. And as I said, we'll be following up with a link to this recording and some additional resources. Again, thank you, Ashton, Connie, and Harry, and thank you all for joining us. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Aye.
That was fun. That was really fun.
I thought it was fine. It went exactly as I hoped it would. Exactly.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I
Can we-
now
Can you
know,
stop recording, maybe?
Are we sure that the entire webinar is not listening to us? Not
Doesn't matter if they
said
listen. I don't
anything
care.
Okay.
I was delighted that so many people tuned into this. That's what I meant. I think that it indicates there's a lot more potential for